for today. Mhairi Snowden. So Mhairi is the director of HRCS, which is the Human Rights Consortium Scotland, and they are the civil society network to defend and promote human rights in Scotland. So Mhairi, I will stop screen sharing now and let you pop your presentation up.
Brilliant, thanks, Suki. It's brilliant to be here today and actually see some names from all different parts of Scotland. Yeah, so as Suki said, I work for the Human Rights Consortium Scotland. We've been having loads of events and discussions around this Human Rights Bill consultation, because we think this bill is really, really important and is actually quite an exciting development in terms of putting human rights actually into law in a way that's enforceable. And what's really encouraging is there's loads of really wide engagement from all different organisations around, well, what it could mean for the people that they work with or for, and sort of grappling with some of the details. So I've got 20 minutes, which I'm just going to give you a sort of a brief overview of what the bill is all about, and some of the sort of key bits of the consultation. So okay, so get to move on now. So as I said, yeah, just an overview and some key parts. I think Alice will send out the slides afterwards. And just to note that we, from the consortium, we produced a guide to responding. So if you are thinking about writing your own consultation response, and that guide might be helpful because it goes into more detail on each of the questions. We're not going to do that today. We're not going to go through all the kind of questions. You'll be glad to hear, actually. But that guide you can look at and refer to afterwards. So the consultation is available obviously online. It's available in all different formats, including child-friendly formats produced by Together, which are really helpful for everyone. I know there's time for questions after I've spoken, but absolutely also feel free to get in touch by email afterwards if you want to talk about any specific part of it or get into any of the detail. The consultation has 44 questions. It's massive, you know. Some of them repeat themselves and are a little bit kind of all over the place, but so it is large. And the closing date is the 5th of October. But it is important to note, as with all consultations, you don't have to respond to the whole thing. But what is important to note is that it's really important that this bill is not written just by lawyers or by policy boards or even civil servants, but actually it's written based on people's real experience of rights and how they use them and how they access them. So it's brilliant actually that you're all here today because your experience and expertise is essential to that discussion. I wonder if I said to you what do you think of the state of human rights in Scotland or the UK at the moment, how you would respond to that. Really, in recent years, we've seen human rights at a UK level go backwards very significantly in the last few months. And yet for years, we've had campaigning and moves towards bringing more of our human rights into law in Scotland. Really specifically, where this bill has come from was that there was a national task force on human rights leadership set up by the Scottish Government. I was on that from a civil society point of view. And that task force asked that question around what should enhanced human rights law in Scotland look like? Basically, if we're going to improve our human rights law, what should be in it? And then they made a whole host of recommendations. All of them, notably, were accepted by the Scottish Government, and they committed to pass a bill before May 2026. So that's this parliamentary session. Actually, we just heard a couple of days ago in the programme for government, or was it last week? Time has passed, that they will introduce the bill by June next year. So we're on quite a tight timescale, actually, in terms of this bill. But since the task force recommendations, there's also been the UNCRC bill. So that is the bill that brings Children's Rights Convention into Scots law. It was passed unanimously, that's by all political parties. But if you've also been watching this, you'll know that it was referred to the Supreme Court. And basically the Supreme Court ruling said, well, first of all, what's important is that we can incorporate international human rights in the Scottish Parliament. So the court actually confirmed that. But they said, actually, you need to amend that bill so it stays within devolved limits. So it cannot appear to or actually impact anything that's within the remit of Westminster. And that is why it needs to be amended. So actually the tomorrow, the Scottish Parliament are going to start the process to amend that bill. Finally, we've been waiting for ages, but it will start tomorrow, and they hope that the amendments will be passed by Christmas. But that's one of the key things, is this is a devolved bill. How do we make sure it stays within those limits? Also in that time, there was a number of advisory groups set up by the Scottish Government, including lived experience boards. I can send out the link afterwards, actually, maybe you can share it around, but the reports from those lived experience boards are really, really good and really practical about what needs to be in the bill. And then finally, after a big delay, we've got the consultation. As I say, it's open until the 5th of October. So that is how we've got to here. But actually, what is the bill all about? Well, firstly, it is about dignity. So this is a core principle of human rights. It's not about the relationship between you and I, between individuals. Human rights is very much about how the state, as a government bodies, treat individuals and communities. And it means that there's things that they cannot do and things that they should do in order that everyone is treated with respect for their dignity. And that includes everyone. So regardless of who you are, where you were born, what immigration paperwork you have, what you've done, what you look like, any of those things, it is all about dignity for everyone. And this bill is also not about us deciding for Scotland what our human rights will be. It's not about some sort of discussion around that. It's actually about bringing what is already agreed at international level into our law in Scotland. So it's all about incorporating international human rights. The thing is, right now, we actually have some of these international human rights in our law already. So these are what are often called our civil and political rights. So things like freedom of association, freedom of expression, right to a fair trial, right to life. Quite often, what people automatically think of, actually, when you talk about human rights, those have been in UK law since 1998 through the Human Rights Act, and actually baked in to the Scottish Parliament through the Scotland Act. So we have those, and those are enforceable and come with duties on public bodies. And as I said before, that we will soon have Children's Rights Convention in our law already. But the big plan for this Scottish Human Rights Bill is basically to put those international human rights that are missing from our law at the moment and incorporate them. So key to that are what is called our economic, social and cultural rights, sometimes called our everyday rights. And these sit within that International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which is a mouthful. I totally get that. It's shortened to ISESCR. But basically, these are things that are basic essentials that we all need to live a decent life. So right to food, the right to health, the right to adequate housing, right to education, right to social security. So the big plan that the government is committed to is to incorporate that treaty with all of those rights into as part of this bill. But they also recognise that there are other treaties that give particular protections for other groups. So alongside the CRC for children, there's also CEDAW, which is about women's rights, CRPD, which is about disabled people's rights, and CERD, which is rights related to race. So again, the big picture and the commitment is to incorporate those treaties as well. And then alongside that, there was just recognition that actually all of our human rights crumble if we do not have a healthy environment. So it's absolutely right that that's part of this picture. So things like clean air and safe water need to be part of this bill as well. So that's the big picture of what the bill intends to do. But why? Because it's not just like a nice sounding thing to do. This is actually important because of the why. So this will mean that all of our human rights, so not just those civil and political ones, but all of our human rights become a real baseline across Scottish law and policy. It's almost constitutional in nature, and it will mean that everything will have to comply with all of those rights. It will mean that we'll be able to name and claim our human rights. So you'll be able to be really specifically this, I have the human right to this, and there'll be ways to claim them as well. So there's a real strength to that. And importantly, will be enforceable. So they'll be enforceable ultimately in court if need be. Not that we want everyone to be lots of cases and that absolutely wouldn't happen, but we know that actually rights are not rights unless they're enforceable, actually, unless there's some way to get remedy on them through courts. And so we need the teeth of those rights as part of this bill. And by that is what incorporation into our law means, that they'll become enforceable. It will also, I think, change that conversation around the table almost between individuals and communities and public bodies. So we hear quite often there's a bit of a so what about human rights. So if you mention human rights, there's a, well, yeah, great, but so what? Or that is met with a wee bit of you're being a little bit too aggressive there or something. Actually, it should mean that conversation becomes not whether a public body will protect human rights, but how they're going to do it. So it should change that relationship. And baked into this also is that core principle that this is not just about a sort of tick box compliance, but actually at the heart of economic and social rights, there is that requirement to improve. So it's not just the public bodies just tick a box and stop, but actually they must take plans to keep improving and taking steps on rights. And that's a core part of this bill as well. And alongside that, it's all about accountability. Actually, one of the lived experience boards, that was one of their main messages, that this bill has got to be all about accountability. How do we hold the government to account for fulfilling on their rights obligations, for doing what they're meant to do when it comes to rights? What impact will the bill have? Well, actually, that depends on what is in it. So we're just at the consultation stage. That's still got to be written, and how it's implemented, which is crucial, as you know. But here's what it should lead to. It should lead to rights-based decision-making by public bodies, where they are always thinking and applying rights in terms of their things like their priorities that they set, how they make budgets, how they design new services, how they think about training for staff. At every level, they should be building human rights into the fabric of their decision making. It should mean that no one is just left behind or ignored, that actually the core of human rights actually are often minorities and minorities within minorities, and actually they cannot be ignored. So a key question for public bodies will be who is missing out on these rights, and what do we know about that? Why is that the case? And they should be listening to people about how to make sure that their rights are realised. As I said before, it should lead to remedy and justice and be able to hold government to account. Very often at the moment, if you experience an infringement of these rights, just so little you can do about it. But actually, this bill should improve ways to be able to get remedy. And it should build a human rights culture where it just becomes totally unacceptable for people to live without these basic rights being realised. So that is what we're aiming for. But actually, I'm sure you know from your work and your discussions, it needs to lead to change. What we don't want is a law passed that sits on the shelf or it becomes a tick boxy thing. We want it to actually bring change where we see human rights better realised. So we get this bill passed, and in 5 years' time, more people should live with their rights being realised than right now. But that means getting this bill right, and it means getting all the rights and the duties and the accountability levers built into it in order to drive that change, both when it's passed, but also in the years to come. So that's a big challenge in terms of this consultation, really, is making sure that all the messages around that are heard by the government. So just briefly then around what are the government actually proposing then that this bill will include. So first of all, the rights themselves, so that they're saying that full text of that ICESCR, so that's that Treaty on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and the full text of what we've sometimes called special protection treaties or group treaties. So that's women's rights, disabled people's rights, and rights related to race. So the full text of each of those will be in the bill, minus any bits that are reserved. So minus bits that sit at Westminster. So that some of that is quite significant. So we can't incorporate the right to work fully, for example, because most of employment sits at Westminster. There might be certain elements like vocational training that can be in there. It cannot affect anything related to immigration, for example, and things around the equal opportunities reservation and more we can come back to. So there's certain bits that they have to carve out of these treaties if it can sit within a devolved bill. But nonetheless, lots of those treaties will be there. And alongside that, as I mentioned before, the right to a healthy environment. So that right actually includes lots of different elements to it. So there's 6 different bits. Again, you can look in our guide to see what those are, or that the Environmental Rights Centre for Scotland is a brilliant resource around that if you're specifically interested in that area. So that's the rights. Okay, but to go alongside the rights, we need there to be duties. So duties basically to put them into effect. So what the government is proposing are 2 kinds of duties that will be on all Scottish public authorities and on some private actors, including some charities actually, which is an interesting area. So if those private bodies or charities are delivering what is called like public functions, sort of services of a public nature. So the idea being that a government body can't just contract out of their human rights obligations. They are still there no matter who actually delivers the service. So anyway, 2 basic types of duties. So first of all, the first one that will apply will be this, what they're calling a procedural duty. It basically says that public bodies need to take these rights into account across their work. The Consultation doesn't spell out exactly what that duty should be. We actually think it should be the duty to have due regard. But nonetheless, that will be the first one. And then at some time later, there will be this stronger, this is the enforcement duty. This is the duty to comply, as in if you do not comply with this, ultimately you could be taken to court. Again, that's not the point of it, but that's the teeth bit. And it said, actually, if public bodies are complying, then they'll do 2 things. So first of all, they'll deliver on what is called minimum core obligations. Just a brief word on this, because I think this is actually really, really important, and can just say it's genuinely not just Scottish government rhetoric, genuinely world leading actually to put this into law. So minimum core obligations are the baseline minimum level of rights that should be met immediately for everyone all of the time. So we're not talking about things that we would genuinely kind of expect or like public bodies to do, but actually real baseline. But then we all know individuals and communities who miss out on some of those real baseline levels of rights. And there's guidelines for these minimums set out by the UN at that international level, but they need to be really clearly defined for Scotland. And the government said they'll do that through a participatory approach. So there's a question on that in the consultation. So that's that minimum core obligations. And then the other part, if they are complying, they will also be able to demonstrate progressive realisation of rights. So that basically means taking those concrete steps to improve. And that includes using their maximum available resources to do so. So if they're complying, they'll be doing these 2 things, which is actually really strong. Here's a sort of, again, we'll send the slides out in case this, but there was that full text then of those treaties minus the reserve parts as soon as the bill's passed. Then there'll be a period of time where they're going to write the guidance, and then the first procedural duty will come in. And then there'll be a period of time after that when that strong duty to comply will come in on ISESCR and the right to healthy environment. So at the moment, the government are saying, well, they can't apply that strong duty on the 3 group treaties because of reserve devolved problems with that, doing that. We do actually think they can go further than they're suggesting at the moment. We think they definitely need to apply that duty to comply on some disabled people's rights in particular. They've also, the consultation goes through some other elements that need to be taken into account to interpret those rights. I won't go into these hugely just now, but happy to come back to them. Importantly, that includes using dignity as a core principle, and dignity will be taken into account by courts, for example, when they're making decisions. And I think it's really interesting because it is possible to deliver on some of those baseline level of rights without dignity. So when you think of discussions we've had around the right to food, for example, it's possible that you've got enough food and yet not done in a way that respects your dignity. You know, whether it's you've got to stand in a long line at a food bank on a Monday morning to get the food you need, that would not be protecting your dignity. So I think it's quite an interesting approach. In short, from a consortium point of view, we think, I mean, it's really good to see this consultation. Lots of bits of what they're proposing are actually not bad, in a sort of Scottish way, not bad, but could be much better and need to be better, actually. So, for example, we think things like there should be a purpose clause in the bill, that we need to make the duties as strong as possible on as many rights as possible. We need to have a duty to comply on disabled people's rights. LGBTI and older people should be named, and importantly, there should be timescales set out in the bill. So we are worried that we get this bill passed and then it gets kicked into the long grass for a long time in terms of actually bringing it all in. So timescales need to be in the bill. We think they could do more to improve around access to remedy and justice, and they need to do more to make really strong accountability through reports from government on what they're doing and through scrutiny of those. Just to flag up a few other really key bits, I think, of the consultation that might be really relevant to your organisations. So one, there's this one question about participation, which is really broad. So how can we best embed participation in the framework of the bill? This is just so crucial, actually, that if we get genuine participation of people whose rights are most at risk, right, and if we really improve that, then that could be crucial to actually making those rights real for people. So I'm wondering, from your experience, at what point is it crucial to include participation in the law so that it is a must at those points, not just a best practice or a good thing to do, but must happen? There are also questions around information and awareness. Honestly, the consultation is quite rubbish on this, in that it only includes a couple of paragraphs. And from a consortium point of view, and I wonder from yours as well, it's just so crucial because most people do not know that they have human rights, let alone what they are, how they apply, or how to use them when things are going wrong. It's just so crucial to the whole thing. We know at the moment, like we have a problem with the Human Rights Act rights, for example, that most people do not know about them. So we need to improve that for this. So we'll be flagging up that we think it's time for a national network for human rights information, advice and education, something national but works local. To make sure people have the information that they need when they need it, and they know who to speak to for more detailed advice. At the moment, it's just really difficult to think about who would you speak to for advice, detailed advice around human rights. Really tricky. And we think there should be a public awareness campaign on the bill. Indeed, the task force recommended that, so the government should do it. And then secondly, there's a question in there about building the capacity across the public sector in terms of delivering rights in the bill. And if we really want this to lead to change, including culture change, including just changing that conversation around the table and making the whole system work, we know that there's a massive job to be done in terms of public body capacity around this, and at all levels. So both like at leadership level, but also in terms of frontline services. So you might have perspectives from your experience of what that needs to look like. I think that's a really, one very small but really crucial question. I'm going to stop sharing there. I realised that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour. Honestly, 44 questions. There's a lot to it. And I mean, this is massive, but it's just so important that we get this right, because this is actually baking in human rights to everything we do in Scotland in terms of law and policy and budgets and resources and how public bodies treat people for the years to come. So it's massively important, but there's a lot to it. So I'm happy to take any questions or go into any bits in more detail.